Most of the names that I see on here, I've seen on our registration list. If you haven't already done so, please register, and Vanya just dropped the link on the chat, in the chat. So if anything, this is the most important and least lowest stakes step of the process. So don't preclude yourself from participating in the competition by not registering. You absolutely must be registered in order to compete in Grad Slam. So at least take that first step if you haven't already done so. We just need some information from you at this point, and that's about it. After the registration deadline, the next thing to note is the video submission preliminary round deadline, which is February 6th. So to enter the preliminary round, you must have registered and then attend a small group coaching session. And those will be next week. And if you've registered, you'll be receiving the link to those small group coaching sessions via email. So you need to be registered for one of those small group coaching sessions. And then from the preliminary round, we will be selecting the top 20 competitors to move forward to our in-person semifinal rounds on Thursday, March 2nd. And those will be held at the Young Research Library main conference room. And those are going to be in person. So that means you have to be there to compete in person on campus. And then from the semifinal rounds, we will select the top 10 to compete in the final competition and celebration that will be held on Tuesday, March 14th at the California Nanosystems Institute auditorium here on campus. And again, that one is in person as well. And then our campus champion will go on to compete at the UC-wide competition, which will be in May. So we don't have the final date for that yet, but it will be in May. And those are the most important things to note about the competition. And then, of course, Grad Slam is all about presenting in 3 minutes, and this year with just one slide. So that's the new rule change for this year. So for this, Francesca will go over this a little bit more, but for the rule change, it's just one slide, and you are allowed to use animation and transitions this year, and you can use, you're allowed to use PowerPoint for your one slide. No other formats will be allowed. But you can use animation and transitions, and you can, there's no limit to the number of animations you can use on that one slide. As long as everything happens within that one slide, that's fine. So having said that, visuals will not be scored this year. So that's not, and it's not going to be included in the scorecard for the judges. So again, that's being taken out of the scoring criteria. And also remember that the one slide is optional. You don't have to use it. We encourage it, but it is optional. So that's the basic gist with the slide rule for this year. And if you're familiar with Grad Slam or have competed before, you know that this is, it used to be 3 slides, but this year it's only 1. And with that, I'll go ahead and hand it off to Francesca for the rest. Oh, and I do need to let you know that we are recording this workshop. So if you don't want to be on camera, you can go ahead and keep your camera off. So go ahead, Francesca.
Thank you. If you don't mind being on camera, I would love to see faces. Not that I don't love seeing the OER team on screen, but I see them mostly every day too. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and let me know that you're seeing the slide. Yes? Okay, wonderful. Well, thank you. Hello and welcome to our presentation today called Finesse Your Slide, Tips and Tricks for Your Grad Slam Slide. My name is Francesca Gaccio, and I'll be leading today's workshop. I'm going to try my best to keep this workshop lean. So we are actually going to get to your questions at the end of the presentation. But if you do have any questions, please type them in the chat, and one of my colleagues from the Grad Slam team will be monitoring the chat and compiling those questions, and we'll have time at the end to go through them. If you are at the info session, the slide will look familiar. There's a QR code to the Grad Slam website, so feel free to go to that site if you have additional questions. All right, so before we start, I want to just take the temperature in the room and ask for some audience participation. This may be the only audience participation, so like really milk it, because for the rest of the presentation, there might not be as much. So using the Zoom raise hand function or raise your hand on your screen, raise your hand if you have sat through a really long PowerPoint presentation and you didn't remember anything. All right, so raise your hand or keep your hand raised if you have given a really long PowerPoint presentation and you wondered if anyone remembered anything. We're basically all guilty of this, right? So this is a bit of a setup because I knew already that most of us are guilty on both sides of this experience, and also you can lower your hands now. So knowing that we have been subjected and we have subjected others to PowerPoint presentations where information might not stick very well, let's talk about how we can use visual aids like PowerPoint to communicate more effectively so that in Grad Slam and in other presentations that you will be doing, your presentations can relay information without overly taxing your audience's attention or memory. So we're really gonna walk ourselves back from our previous experiences here. And so the one thing that I want us to keep in mind as we move through this presentation is that people will forget most of the information you give them, but you can choose what they remember with a visual aid. Now, I put an asterisk there because not everything can be made sticky, right, with visual aids. Sometimes folks really remember clever or moving openings, stories, a really good example, or if you were in the workshop on the basic presentation skills, kinesthetic elements, right, touch. But for our purposes today, we're going to talk about how visual aids in a PowerPoint slide can be used in your presentation to make information stick a little better. So in this workshop, I'll be posing mostly questions, some principles, some tips to reflect on as you prepare your recorded talks for Grad Slam or whenever you're considering using a visual aid when presenting, that will help you decide how to best use your visual aid to augment and complement your talk. Along the way, we'll look at examples from former Grad Slam participants, but keep in mind that the examples that I'm using here are not objectively the best slides. Rather, I want us to look at them so that you can take inspiration from them, right? That can help you decide if you want to use the optional slide or ultimately you want to reject the need for a slide for your presentation. And so we begin with our most important question before you even click on the little PowerPoint button on your computer. What is the purpose of your slide? And you want to ask yourself a series of questions, right? Before you can decide that, ask yourself, will my slide illustrate a key point, demonstrate examples, emphasize a central idea, or evoke strong feelings or impressions? And I want you to ask yourself these questions because the answer could very well be that you don't need a slide to do any of those things, right? And you don't actually need to create one. And remember that for this competition, I know Ivy talked about it, but bears repeating. Although Grad Slam now requires only one slide per competitor with the use of animations on the slide, there are no points awarded for visuals anymore, right? So you won't be scored on that. But if you feel like the slide is not going to be crucial to your talk, then don't even use it, right? Don't even worry about it. However, if you do decide to use it, the rest of this presentation kind of take you through some principles and some questions you want to be thinking about. Our ultimate goal when designing a PowerPoint slide should be, doesn't always happen, but for this one, the one slide that you're going to use, it should be to balance information with attention, right? Very important. And this is because you want to use your slide to augment and complement your talk, right? Remember that you are the presentation, not the PowerPoint slide, right? We're there to listen to you talk and learn more about your research. If the visual aid helps achieve that, helps us learn a little bit more about your research, then great. If it won't, don't worry about it. So let's say you're like, yes, Francesca, I'm going to use that one slide. I'm going to make the best slide they've ever seen. Very ambitious. But before you do that, you also want to think about how you will be using your slide, right? Decide if you want to ignore your slide or if you want to reference it. So I give you, sorry, I think I got logged out of my Zoom. 1 second, I have to pause this share and redo. Okay, I think it's fine. We'll keep going. Okay, so I give you these two options, right? Ignore it or reference it, because it will determine how you are going to deploy visual elements in your talk and how you're actually going to interact or work around the slide. So ignoring your slide, here are two examples, means you are using the image or a set of images as backdrop. So one goal you might achieve by using this approach is that you're taking your audience on a journey verbally primarily and visually maybe, right? By that, I mean that the visual isn't really playing a significant part, but rather reinforcing a feeling or an idea, like in these two examples, but the focus is on the talk itself, right? So even from these stills, you can see that like, oh, there's something going on about this scientist and a phlegm or virus, right? Or whatever it is. And there are several examples of Egyptian artifacts, right? On the other picture. When you're using this approach, the image should speak clearly to the audience since you will not be providing the context around it, right? It should be clear and focused, so good enough quality, and even thinking about these pictures, the scale of the projector, right? So make sure that you're choosing a photo that will project well on a big screen, and easily accessible, right? So the picture on the left, I'm not sure if it's phlegm or bacteria, but we know it's not, it's something, right? It's potentially a virus. So for using something like this approach, I recommend using representative images because it will communicate much more clearly and quickly if the image refers to something we can all easily define, right? And because you're not providing the context for it necessarily or pointing to it using the ignore it approach, it really needs to speak for itself. The reference it approach requires you to directly engage with the images or text or both that you provide in your slide, right? So to do this effectively, you'd want to choose like a short period of time during your talk, a 15 to 30-second window to draw the audience's attention to the slide. So you actually have to like tell us, right? If you look at this slide over here, cue the audience that they need to be looking more closely at your image. When you're using this approach, you want to be specific and direct because you are referencing the slide, but it's also something that you want to plan for, right? You want to create an effect. You want to plan the moment to point to your PowerPoint slide, when to highlight it, and then when to draw the audience back to you so that you're back to talking, right? And so this is part of the additional challenge of a reference and example is that you have to move, you kind of have to like take your audience's attention from one spot to and back to the other. And again, something that has worked very well for a lot of Grad Slam competitors, and it's very common. This is last year's Grad Slam champion. Some motivations for using the reference it approach might be to help explain complex ideas. or to visually summarize key project elements, as you can see in this example, right? There's a lot going on with this slide, but you'll see that there's this red kind of box around some numbers here. Presumably, the speaker would have turned to highlight like that specific like range of information, right? But regardless of how you want to approach your PowerPoint slide, you should not rely on your slide to convey your entire message, right? Because again, you're the presentation, not the slide. And so these are the first set of considerations you want to make before you even create a PowerPoint slide, right? Think about how it will augment and complement your talk. And if you think it won't, don't try it. Don't go for it. Decide, and if you do decide to use a PowerPoint slide, choose how you're going to use it, right? How you're going to approach it and incorporate it into your presentation. Will you ignore it or will you reference it? And also, do not rely on your slide to convey your entire message. I'm not looking at the chat, but I'm guessing there are no questions. No? Okay. I'll move on. So now you're like, yes, I've made all these decisions. I feel really excited about this PowerPoint slide. And now this slide is blank and I don't know what to put in it. So we're going to talk about how to go about a design strategy for your PowerPoint slide. We're going to talk about different ways you can utilize and even maximize the space of a 16:9 PowerPoint slide. And remember that if you're using PowerPoint, make sure that it is the 16:9 ratio. There is sometimes it flips it to the other ratio, which is like basically a square, right? Shorter. So we'll talk about 3 design strategies. One, we're going to talk about using one image for the entire slide, which we've already seen examples of. We're going to talk about designing graphics or combining images. And our third design strategy is using the slide as a grid with sections. Now, these are all different options that you can take as is, or you can kind of modify for your own use. If you were in yesterday's workshop on basic presentation skills, David suggested that you match, right, the content to the kind of aids, visual aids that you will be using in your presentation. So the first design strategy is pretty straightforward. You're basically using the entire slide to project your image like a photo or an illustration. This approach helps to create a focal point for the audience, often creating one visual message. And this is particularly important because you'd want the audience to focus on your talk, right? So you're really kind of capitalizing on one central image to help support your talk. So this is an example from last year's UCLA Grad Slam champion. On this slide, the speaker has decided to use a single image. This is a stingray of some kind. In their talk, they used this slide to introduce a familiar looking sea creature, but one that might not be as well known. So let's kind of just take a couple of seconds to process what we're looking at, to see the image for any context of what this could be. And feel free to type in the chat or just make some mental notes for yourself about how you're kind of encountering this image. And, you know, I'll take a second or two process that. So, thanks for participating. Yes, so it's a distinctive image that makes you curious about what kind of creature it is, right? Immediately obvious what the image is, doesn't take a lot of attention, right? So it piques curiosity, right, immediately. I remember when I first saw it, I was like, I don't know what that is. Sea animals, not my best, not my forte, not my expertise. And I didn't know what I was looking at. So it took a while for me. But like a couple of our the comments in the chat, right? When you use an image that only has sort of this singular visual element, it can be very effective in focusing the audience to the message that the image is conveying, right? In this case, we're all focused on the stingray. Even if you didn't know it was a stingray, like I did last year, right? I'm looking at it. The image is also quite compelling. So like our other comment here, it's swimming in the dark. And so we see the general shape of the animal. And I don't know how your screen resolutions are, but there's actually shades of gray on the background of this photo that seem like rocks on the ocean floor, but it's like dark. Now, something like this can be effective because, especially in the opening, right? Because it piques your interest, you're immediately curious. Now, a design strategy like this can use both a reference it or an ignore it approach, but remember, it depends on the type of image that you use. But I also maybe want to think about how this image might not work. Did anyone kind of come across like any, I don't know, barriers to looking at this image? So we have a comment here, not clear what the point of the image might be, confused about the purpose of showing this image, right? So why is this important to me, right? So I think in the same vein that it's like, oh, it's so compelling. What is it? And also, why, right? Like these are the questions that your audience might be asking. So it's fair to ask, is the image itself too mysterious, right? If we don't immediately know what we're looking at, do our brains sort of wander off and we're no longer listening to the talk, right? And again, related to the first question, does the image need an explanation for it to make sense, right? Which would mean either using a reference it approach or perhaps another element to this in terms of text or maybe some kind of descriptive language. So something to keep in mind. Now, our second design strategy looks at creating your own graphics or combining images. This approach allows you to visually represent complex information, such as depicting a process or providing an example to be more easily understood, right? So we're going to look at 3 examples of this strategy. Under this strategy, like creating your own graphs fall under this design strategy. And we'll take a look at some examples here from former Grad Slam participants. So here's our first one. Let's kind of walk through this image. There's a lot, right? We'll start at the top. So we have 2 texts on 2 sides of the slide. And in the middle is a giant wine glass that has an illustration of a brain in it with circles and stars around it, suggesting intoxication, perhaps. And then right below it, we have an illustration of a man on a couch appearing to have a headache, right? He has his hands on his head. And on the sides are 2 almost empty wine glasses, right? So based on this image, we are likely to conclude that this has something to do with alcohol consumption and something about the brain's involvement in it, potentially, since there's a giant brain in the middle. Now, why might be something like this effective? I'm happy to hear comments, but I'm also happy to move on. I know we're at 12:30. Well, the first image is colorful, right? So it's immediately attention grabbing. There are also 2 main ideas that are highlighted by text and by numbers. So notice how they're limited to data and really short text, right? So that's also something to consider if there's kind of a compelling data point that you want to highlight. That could be something that you include in your slide. But also, as I mentioned earlier, the image suggests what might be the issue or the topic of the talk. But there might also be ways that this is ineffective, right? Does the combination of images make it too abstract? Is it so colorful that it's distracting? Does it require too much processing for us, right? So again, depending on the approach, is it going to be distracting? Here's another example of designing graphics to describe a process. The angle might be a little challenging, but I wanted to show sort of what that scale is, right? From a presenter standing in front or to the side of a projector screen. So you can see how the graphics might be working or not working for you as an audience. So here are two images that are showing process. On the left is an example of nutrient cycling. So there's a label there. And on the right, the image is titled Wildfire Depositions. And then you can see arrows to denote a process on both slides. Now, let's think about the overall effect, right? The images are colorful, so that's attention grabbing, and relatively simple. We get the point of arrows pointing at each other, denoting a process. So we can process the images rather easily, even if we're not experts in whatever this topic is, right? But let's also think about the use of phrases and words in this example. Remember that the longer chain of words you have on a slide, the harder it is for the audience to read and listen to you while you're talking, right? So if you're going to use this approach and you feel like you need a lot of words, it might be better to consider a referenced approach and then using animation to make the words appear when they are relevant, right? And of course, this contestant might have done that, but they didn't have animations as an option in previous competitions. But remember that you're always trying to balance, right, that attention. Because if you're looking at something and you're listening at something, you can't do both, right? It takes processing time to do both. Our final example in this approach is to combine images. So take a couple of seconds to look at this slide. Take note of what your eyes are immediately attracted to, what message you think the slide is conveying, and what impressions you are getting about the topic of this talk. There's a lot to kind of process here. We have images, we have text, we have clip art, and we have an illustration. Feel free to make a mental note here of how you're reacting to this image as we move on here. So there are a couple of advantages in combining images in that it can help you tell a larger cohesive story, right? Especially if your research is interdisciplinary or has multiple components. Because you have several images that you can use, you can build information, right? Provided they are organized appropriately, right? So thinking about how our reading patterns immediately draw our eyes from left to right, you can take advantage of that reading pattern, right? Maybe the most important, most immediate thing can be on the left because it's the first thing that we will see, right? So even looking at this slide, we can create, the slide creates a relationship between sewage and waste pollution. They're side by side. So it's showing similarity perhaps or some kind of other relationship in terms of tone and meaning. But how might that message change if it was top down, right? Top to bottom. We will likely think that there's a hierarchical order or a hierarchical relationship at play. And depending on your talk, make sure that that's what you intend the audience to get from the arrangement of combined images, right? And also depending on the images that you use, you can help to suggest the tone of the talk and the central issue or topic, just like this photo, right? There's something kind of very unsettling about the two images that are presented side by side. But perhaps as some of you are already seeing, it can be too busy. And keep in mind like that, like too many words, too many images will require more processing time for your audience, right? That might compete with what you're saying to them. So I can imagine that some of you already tuned me out because you're trying to process this picture, right? And that's a natural thing that happens with our attention, right? But keep that in mind because you're basically splitting the audience's attention when you make a visual aid too busy or have too much information, right? Which makes it less likely that your audience will remember anything that you said, right? Or anything that they've seen. Our last design strategy is to use the slide as a grid with sections. And this might help to manage the attention of your audience a little bit more effectively, especially if you're going to use a combination of images or if you want to depict a series of related thoughts or points. Now, what this strategy allows you to do is to create momentum, but also it lets you split the screen into chunks, right? That can encourage better focus. So this design strategy requires a referenced approach, right? It can't be ignored, basically. Some motivations for doing this might be to explain complex ideas and you kind of want to chunk that information, or if you want to visually summarize like project elements. So let's take a look at this example from a former Grad Slam participant. Now, this was a slide that did not have animations. I'm adding the animations to this example. But I'd like you to pay attention to how you're understanding or apprehending the information as they appear. So you'll see that the entirety of the slide is used, right? But because of kind of using it as a grid and the grid function and the animation, it helps to kind of break up the screen into these long vertical lines. So why might this be effective, right? Well, first, because the sections are animated in through clicks, and it's a very minimal amount of animation. It helps to take the audience through the stages, right? Through the chunks of the screen, which can help with focus and with scaffolding information, right? You're giving information little by little. This means that you're not giving the information all at once and giving it to them at appropriate times, which means that they're not ahead of you, right? Or you're pacing how they're interacting with your talk. But even without the use of animations, how the different elements are organized and the use of arrows tells us how to read the image as a series, right? It helps to pace our attention through the information. So this is really helpful when you're using a referenced approach. So again, you'd want to choose like a window of time during your talk to take people through the PowerPoint, right? Or to take people through the information. And again, keep in mind that when you're giving information at piecemeal like this, you want to match the language that you're using to the language on the screen. So again, so you're not splitting your audience's attention, right? You're minimizing the amount of like processing that they have to do between listening to you and looking at something that you're referencing in a slide. So here's just a quick summary of the 3 design strategies. Remember that whatever design strategy you choose, make sure that the visual information you are providing does not distract or take away from comprehending your talk. Any questions before I move on to animations? If you do have questions, please drop them in the chat and I'll answer them at the end. So now you're like, wow, I'm so excited. I decided my design strategy. Let me at these animations. I want to use all of them. Well, first I say, let's relax. Let's not use all of them. But there are a few kind of questions to ask and some options for you to explore. And just a reminder, animations are okay. No points for visuals. Just want to reiterate that. So if at this point you're like worried or you're anxious and you're stressing about this is your out. You don't even need to use it. So how to decide if you want to use or when to use your animations. Animations can be useful for a variety of reasons. As is the theme of our talk today, you always want to ask yourself questions whenever it comes to using any of the strategies we talked about, right? You want to ask yourself, what does the animation add to my talk, right? Will it help to create like a dramatic effect? Will it help to reiterate a central message or point? Will it help make information more memorable, right? Or is it just distracting? Are you using the animation to create engagement instead of using the content of the talk to resonate with your audience? Or is it truly enhancing, right? Or increasing the stickiness of your message? You also want to ask yourself, what effect does it create for the audience? Will this be distracting for them? Is the information accessible enough with or without the use of the animation. So just really briefly, there are different kinds of animations on PowerPoint that you can use. PowerPoint organizes it as basic, subtle, moderate, and exciting. So as the categories suggest, these describe the kind of dynamic movement the chosen animation in that category would produce, right? PowerPoint also has exit animations, which, as the name says, animates objects out of a slide. And we'll look at an example of that, one example of that a little bit later. But really the point here is to, I encourage you to experiment which animations would augment and complement your slide, but I would issue a warning about the use of moderate and exciting animations, because overuse of these kinds of animations can distract the audience, or worse, give them motion sickness, like me a few years ago when I first encountered Prezi. So just keep in mind when using some of these more exciting animations. So one animation that we're going to look at kind of 1.5 examples here of animation is we're going to look at the appear animation, which is an entrance animation. And it can be particularly useful for staggering information, right? Because a lot of the text is hidden until you make them appear, it helps the audience kind of stay on the same pace as your talk, right? So they're not getting too far ahead of you. And it helps them to focus on shorter phrases or images that you're trying to, that you're using to communicate your research. This is an example of an animation I used at the Grad Slam info session. So with every click, right, more information comes up, but note that you're moving along as I'm moving along, right? I'm helping people catch up, but also everyone is relatively on the same page, unless of course you weren't paying attention in the first place, then, the animation is irrelevant. But you also want to think about the placement of the text with something like this animation. So you'll see the design strategy that I'm using here is the grid, right? Very similar to that example that I showed earlier with the graph. I'm trying to build steps with the information I'm providing, reinforced by the arrows near the bottom of the boxes. So I started from the bottom left and built towards the top right. So again, capitalizing on the left to right reading pattern, right? So something to consider if you have a lot of information, that an appear animation might help kind of break that up. Now compare this to a combination of the appear animation and a disappear animation, which is an exit animation. And just pay attention to how your attention might fluctuate and also how your memory might fluctuate when you're using something like a combination of an entrance and exit animation. That was a little too fast. So this approach can be useful when you're trying to draw the focus of the audience to one bit of information at the time, right? So the challenge, though, is that you're likely going to strain the audience's short-term memory when one bit of information appears and then disappears when another shows up. So if you want information to accumulate, this combination of animation might not be the best way, right? But if, let's say, the information is important, but not as relevant as the bit of information that you're trying to provide now, then this might be useful for you. I do want to briefly mention here about the advantages of animating content out. It's a good option for drawing the attention back to you, right, the speaker, when you basically wipe the slide free of words or images. Right? It cues the audience that they should go back to listening to you. But again, if you're going to use this kind of approach, always ask yourself, is it adding or is it subtracting from my talk? And so this would be like an example of animating out, right? You're probably still looking at your screen, but if my face were on there, you'd probably be looking at my face. But again, it's also like a cue for your audience that they can relax, right? They don't need to look at something, they can just listen to you. And it kind of minimizes that cognitive load that you're asking of them in a short amount of time, right? So big fan of blank slides. So some things to keep in mind: animations allow you to pack a lot of information into a slide, but remember to keep it simple, not just for the ease of use for yourself, but also it makes it so much harder to manage all the animations when they're on top of each other, right? Again, you want to balance information that you give on the slide with the attention or memory of the audience. To that end, there are some options you can use that don't involve animation. You can use size, color, and a sense of movement through graphics to your advantage, but always use with good judgment, right? Think about the overall effect of every single visual element on your screen. And finally, this is important: practice your talk with the animations, time it, and make sure that the animation is complementing the talk, right? And that it works with the flow of your presentation. Some things to avoid: don't overcrowd it with images and animations. Don't rely on animations to engage your audience. And don't overuse exciting animations. I will be in the audience, and I might get motion sickness if you overuse these exciting animations. So if not for me, please do it for other motion sickness sensitive people. So if nothing else sticks today, because I've subjected you to a long PowerPoint presentation that you don't remember anything, my one hope is that you will remember that when designing a PowerPoint slide, you should aim to balance information with attention. Keep this in mind, and your audience, me, will thank you. And I thank you for your attention today. If I can claim a few more minutes, we do have a survey that we're asking everyone to complete. You can do that while I answer any questions that you might have that were not answered by the presentation, or any other concerns that you might have.
The survey link is in the chat. And again, if you can fill that out for us, we always appreciate feedback.
So that we have a question here. Do you know how we would record animations pacing with our video submission?
Your presentation has to be recorded on Zoom. So we do have instructions on how to record on Zoom. So, and one good thing about recording on Zoom is that you can see exactly, if you can record yourself, and you can do several recordings until you get the right one. That's the one advantage of doing it on Zoom. I don't know if that answered the questions at all, but one thing that we can do is we do have those instructions, and we will send those out to everyone who's registered as part of the next steps email that we send out to all registered participants. So you can record yourself on Zoom, do several takes if you must before the video submission deadline, just to see how you're sounding, how it's looking. So that's, like I said, that's the one advantage of using Zoom, is like you can see exactly what how you're sounding, what the PowerPoint looks like, and how everything is timing out. You can see if you're going over, if it seems like you're talking too fast while your PowerPoint slide is up and while your animations are going on. So I would recommend doing several takes and practicing in front of friends, colleagues, if you can, because at some point you will also have to do this in person if you're selected as a semifinalist or go on to the finals. So I would recommend doing both, having someone watching you present and then doing several takes on Zoom and saving it and watching every single one of those takes to see if there's something that you can tweak. And Courtney just dropped the link to the document on how to record on Zoom if you'd like to check that out. But hopefully that answers your question, Alexis. So, and if you have any questions, as we mentioned, you can email us at gdevents@grad.ucla.edu, and we will try to get back to you as quickly as we can with regards to maybe your PowerPoint or just the competition in general. But definitely, one thing that we would recommend is to practice, and, just get comfortable with it. And in terms of doing the video, and when it comes to the submission deadline, please don't wait until like the last hour, the last 10 minutes to submit it, because, once it hits midnight, that box will close. So, but give yourself plenty of time to practice and to complete that video and to work out your PowerPoint slide. And again, we must emphasize that it is optional. You only have one slide. You can use as many animations as you'd like, but keep in mind what Francesca just went over in this workshop. Keep it simple. Try not to overcrowd or overuse those animations, and see, what works best in getting that important message across when it comes to your presentation. So, but yeah, if there's anything I can add too, is like, keep it simple. That's what I would recommend, is like, keep it clean, keep it simple, and, ask yourself, like Francesca said, does this add to what I'm saying, to what I'm presenting, or does it take away and detract? So, okay, we have a question I got for, we are definitely recording today's workshop. For yesterday's, we have a recording of that too, but I must take note that for yesterday's basic presentation skills workshop, we did go into breakout rooms. So we have recording of the main portion of the workshop in the main room, but the breakout rooms we did not record. So just keep that in mind. And then Vanya has links to our website, which will have the links to the recorded workshops if you need those. And our website also has all the important information in terms of the guidelines, the competition rules and guidelines. So please review those carefully. And if you have any questions, again, let us know. The prizes are listed on there. I didn't mention that today. So for our first place winner, they will receive $5,000. Second place receives $3,000. Third place receives $2,000, and then we have an audience choice winner who will receive $1,000. And then for the preliminary round, if you enter and submit a video, you will receive a $50 gift card as long as you're registered and attended a small group coaching session and submitted a video. So you get something even for just submitting that video. So always worth the time. So thank you to everyone who attended today, and we look forward to seeing your video submissions and seeing you in small group coaching sessions next week. Small group coaching sessions begin on Monday, actually. So we've been sending links to the small group coaching sessions to those who have registered in the competition. So as long as you're registered, then we will send you the links to those and you will get those. But they do start on Monday and they run through to Thursday of next week. So we have several spots available in all of those. But thank you everyone for coming today, and we hope to see you in the competition, and register if you haven't already done so. Deadline is Friday, and tell your friends to register and do the same. Okay. Thank you, everyone.